The main reason I dislike Tom fucking Preston is the fact that he cannot take criticism, and instead attempts to make a mockery of those who are wanting to help him not be a fucking moron.
There are many ways to handle criticism. You can ignore it, you can learn from it, you can improve, or you can write 5-paragraph essays on Tumblr because someone said your anatomy looks stiff. And if you ever needed a masterclass in how not to respond to criticism, the internet has already archived one for you. Because when it comes to taking feedback gracefully, Andrew Dobson might be one of the most studied examples of what happens when ego meets the early 2010s internet. And trust us, the internet never forgets. Now, if you guys don't know who Andrew Dobson is, also known online by his alias Tom Preston 6, congratulations. Your piece has been protected. But back in the late 2000s and early 2010s, he was an aspiring webcomic artist who got his start around 2009 on DeviantArt. At the time, DeviantArt was the place for independent artists, before Instagram, before TikTok, before short-form dopamine farming. Websites like DeviantArt and Newgrounds were where you went if you wanted to build an audience off pure creativity. You could post comics, original characters, animations, even make a bit of money if you build a following, but of course, it wasn't all wholesome. There was plenty of strange content, NSFW content, overly dramatic OC lore, and enough questionable art decisions to fill a museum. But back then, it was still the digital Wild West for independent artists, and into this environment stepped Andrew Dobson, confident, opinionated, ready to teach people about storytelling. There was just one small problem. The internet has never reacted well to someone who presents themselves as an authority, without the skill level to back it up, and that's where things start to spiral, because Andrew didn't just struggle with criticism. He detonated over it. Someone could say, hey, maybe your art hasn't improved much, and instead of brushing it off or working on it, he would respond with long, defensive posts, paragraphs, sometimes essays, explaining why the criticism was wrong, and in return, the internet did what it does best. It screenshotted, it archived, and it trolled massively. What makes this even more interesting is the hypocrisy angle, because while Andrew constantly lashed out at critics and accused people of arguing in bad faith, he did exactly what he was being accused of. Over the years, he faced repeated accusations of tracing artwork, of borrowing ideas a little too closely from other creators, and of making strawman comics that oversimplified or misrepresented opposing arguments just to make his own point look stronger. Now, whether every single one of those accusations was completely fair is still up for debate. The internet has never exactly been known for calm, measured judgment, but what isn't debatable is how he chose to respond. Instead of stepping back, instead of clarifying calmly, instead of letting the noise die down, he would double down. Long posts, defensive explanations, public arguments, paragraph after paragraph dissecting critics and insisting they were wrong, jealous, or deliberately misunderstanding him. And that reaction, more than the original criticism, is what stuck. So today we're going to break down who Andrew Dobson actually was, how he rose during the early days of online art communities, how he handled criticism at every stage of his career, and how those reactions slowly became the defining feature of his online legacy. Because if the early 2010s internet taught us anything, it's this. You don't have to be the worst artist to become infamous. You just have to respond to criticism in the worst possible way. Now let us properly introduce you to him. Andrew Dobson, also known online as Tom Preston 6, or Caddy N, is an American former YouTuber, cartoonist, writer, and animator. He's best known for creating webcomics like So, You're a Cartoonist, The Adventures of Alex Z Pirate, and Formera. His online persona was typically represented as a blue cartoon bear wearing glasses and a fedora, a self-insert character that became closely associated with his brand. For years he operated primarily on platforms like DeviantArt, Twitter, YouTube, and his own personal websites. To many people, it felt like he rose to notoriety in the early 2000s almost out of nowhere, but that wasn't entirely true, because what later resurfaced showed that Andrew had actually been active online long before most people knew his name, just under a different alias and with some seriously absurd kink content. For now, let's rewind way back to Andrew Dobson's humble beginnings. Born in 1981, Dobson grew up in Massachusetts alongside his brother and family. From an early age, he developed a fascination with animation and drawing. According to his own accounts, that passion intensified after he failed middle school. Instead of giving up, he turned inward and began teaching himself animation, experimenting with stop motion in the late 1980s. By the 1990s, he had expanded into both 2D and 3D animation, though he has stated that 2D remained his preferred medium. His childhood and teenage years, however, were not something he describes fondly. Dobson has spoken about being bullied heavily throughout high school. He described those years as miserable, marked by emotional instability and intense mood swings, traits he has claimed ran in his family. At one point, according to his own recounting, he physically confronted one of his bullies, punching him in an attempt to make the harassment stop. The altercation resulted in him being sent to the principal's office, or should we say, he sent himself to the principal's office. And why, you might ask? Well, because that's the type of person he is. Now, the bullying aspect is something we've seen in many similar internet stories. Take Chris Chan, for example, who, much like Andrew, also spoke publicly about being heavily bullied during school and even being banned from the school bus. Andrew himself wrote in one of his posts about a similar experience. I waited outside for my mom to pick me up every single day, all by myself, while everyone else got to go home on the bus. I was banned from the buses way back in kindergarten, getting picked on for being quiet and shy, getting laughed at for standing up for myself. According to Andrew, the situation became so intense that it eventually led to him moving to another state. However, despite his claims of being heavily bullied, some would argue that Andrew wasn't exactly seen as harmless by his school either. In 1998, he reportedly created an illustration of the Millennium Falcon crashing into his high school for the school newspaper, stating that it was meant to celebrate the release of the new Star Wars film at the time. But the school administration did not take the image lightly. As a result, Andrew was sent to a counselor because they thought he wanted to blow up the school. So yeah, after graduating high school, Dobson was accepted into the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. He would later reference parts of his college experience in his comic soap, You're a Cartoonist, including a story about sleeping in the stairwell of his dorm building. It was also around this time that his now iconic fedora became a constant part of his appearance. Because he reportedly wore it daily, some claimed his roommates nicknamed him Hat Andy. And guess what? He didn't like college any better than school. Andrew spoke repeatedly about how disappointing the experience was for him. Now, for those of you who don't know, MCAD is widely regarded as one of the more respected art and design colleges in the United States, a competitive institution that many aspiring artists consider themselves lucky to attend. According to Andrew, it simply wasn't up to par. He has claimed that the animation department was weak, that he wasn't taught anything of real value, and that the program failed to properly support his growth as an animator. Over time, he stated that he essentially discarded much of what he learned there, and chose to follow his own creative philosophy instead. In his own words, we were never taught things that would have actually helped us get careers, like how to make a portfolio, nor did they prepare us for a world where jobs didn't exist anymore. I've had to self-teach myself basically everything. So yeah, rather than adapting to academic critique or institutional structure, Andrew positioned himself as someone who needed to carve his own path, separate from what he saw as flawed instruction. So he taught himself the skills, which probably included him drawing poorly proportionate figures and inconsistent eyebrows. Andrew's dissatisfaction with MCAD didn't stop at general complaints. At one point, he even publicly shared a survey he had filled out where he gave low ratings across multiple categories. It was clear from his own posts that he felt the institution had failed him in several ways, but one thing that really stands out is his claim that the college didn't teach him how to create portfolios. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the reality is quite different. MCAD absolutely does teach students how to build professional portfolios if they want to pursue jobs in the industry. That's kind of standard for an art school. But Andrew seemed to position himself as someone above that process. Instead of adapting to industry expectations, he insisted on doing things his own way, almost as if traditional portfolio building was beneath him. And this mindset is very clearly depicted in an interaction he had with fellow webcomic artist Kazarad. Now this whole exchange is honestly a very insightful peek into Andrew's personality, but we're not going to read the entire thing out loud. There's actually a Tumblr page dedicated to documenting moments like this called The Hypocrisy of Andrew Dobson. And one post on that page highlights a comment by Dobson himself on this very thread. He wrote, "I don't do these things because I already did them in college." Here he was referring to studying color theory and building a portfolio. "I am out of college. I've had 2 books published and gotten several long-term jobs. I am in a position now where enough people know my work that needing a portfolio to get a job isn't as necessary a requirement. I have a recognizable style that people gravitate toward, and I'm hired because they think my style would help them sell their ideas. I don't have to worry about tailoring my art to the job. The job is frequently tailored to me." That's actually a very common thing that happens to artists. This response clearly shows that he thought of himself as something big, someone too good to have a portfolio, and he also admitted to having done it at his college. So yeah, the point is that Andrew Dobson was a big fat liar, and he liked to twist things quite a bit, be it his college or his infamous dislike for drawing anime. But the guy did not have any problem whatsoever taking very heavy inspiration from the said animes he disliked so much. However, that being said, we would now like to move on to the real Andrew Dobson crash out, which was when he joined DeviantArt. So yeah, Tom Preston, aka Andrew Dobson, was heavily obsessed with 90s anime, and of course Nintendo. And his love for Nintendo actually inspired his very first webcomic, which he published on his DeviantArt account in 2009. This webcomic was called Danny and Spot, and let's just say it was absolutely trash. and that's putting it politely. The plot revolved around two characters, a blonde boy named Danny and a cat named Spot. Most of the comic consisted of them having conversations about video games and consoles, specifically the Nintendo Wii and the PlayStation 3. It was basically long stretches of dialogue about gaming preferences and console wars. Spot was the titular, deuteragonist Garfield twin of the webcomic series, and he was the polar opposite of Danny, especially when it came to gaming tastes. Danny, the human character, loved the PlayStation and Xbox consoles, while Spot was the die-hard Nintendo fan. As a result, the two constantly butt heads, with most of the conflict revolving around their clashing opinions on games and hardware rather than any deeper character development or overarching plot. And because Dobson hated Xbox and PlayStation with a passion, he tried to impose his opinions on people in what many readers felt was the most heavy-handed and honestly boring way possible. For instance, look at this. Spot. Man. Games these days. I remember games used to have crazy hero characters and wacky plots. Plumbers, hedgehogs, cavemen, pizza slices, and gorillas, all used to get a piece of the action. Danny, are you done yet? Spot. Now they're all scruffy, buff, moronic nobodies, so the PS3 can't play PS2 games for some reason. The 360 is a paperweight now due to the red ring of death. And this. Life was just so boring and dull when Danny played PS3 and 360, but it's colorful and fun with Wii. We mean, this is just horrible. A major portion of people who had the misfortune of reading the comic ended up calling it boring, and more importantly, a strawman comic. If you guys don't know what that means, a strawman argument is when someone deliberately misrepresents or oversimplifies the opposing side's position, making it easier to attack. Instead of engaging with real arguments, you create a weaker, exaggerated version of them, knock that down, and declare victory. And that's exactly what many critics felt Danny and Spot was doing. Instead of presenting nuanced discussions about gaming preferences, it often reduced opposing viewpoints to exaggerated caricatures, just so Spot, and by extension Dobson, could win the debate. So yeah, Dobson believed that PlayStation was trash because, according to him, it only had edgy first-person shooter games. A take that, as you can imagine, a lot of people strongly disagreed with. And this was just one example of Dobson stirring up chaos with his extremely aggressive opinion. Instead of presenting his preferences as, well, preferences, he framed them like objective truths, and that naturally rubbed people the wrong way. Let's take the Metroid game Scandal, for example. For those of you who don't know, Metroid is one of Nintendo's most iconic franchises, centered around the bounty hunter Samus Aran. The series has a long-standing fan base, and a pretty protective one at that, and when Dobson decided to weigh in on that fandom, things escalated fast. So the controversy was around Metroid, Other M, which was a very controversial game in the franchise. For those who don't know, Other M attempted to blend third-person action with heavy story-driven cutscenes, focusing on Samus Aran's character and backstory. Many fans hated it because they felt it butchered Samus's established personality. According to a lot of fans, it turned Samus Aran, one of gaming's most iconic, independent female protagonists, into a whimpering, overly submissive character who constantly defers to a male superior, obsesses over an alien child, and breaks down crying over villains she had already defeated multiple times. For many, this wasn't just bad writing, it was a complete betrayal of the character, making her act in ways that felt more like genuine misogyny than anything the series had ever shown before. And Andrew? He defended the game religiously, not just casually, but with the kind of intensity that made it clear this wasn't just a personal opinion, this was a crusade. He even went so far as to claim that Metroid Prime, widely considered the best and most popular entry in the series, was actually the worst Metroid game to date, needless to say. That didn't sit well with the fans, and it only added fuel to his reputation for having extreme, often controversial takes on anything remotely popular. So yeah, he argued about it endlessly and managed to irritate a lot of people in the process. But in 2011 came his first real break. He created what would become his first genuinely popular and somewhat successful webcomic. So, You're a Cartoonist, also known as SYAC. Compared to his earlier attempts, this one was actually a noticeable step up. The comic centered around himself as a cartoonist, often depicting the struggles, insecurities, and day-to-day frustrations of trying to make it as an artist, and surprisingly, a lot of cartoonists actually resonated with it, and many related to the themes and appreciated his work. For the first time, Andrew wasn't just stirring controversy, he was building an audience that connected with him. So finally, Andrew was getting some fame. He even collaborated with magician Brentalfloss to create comics parodying video games, which further boosted his visibility online. But fame was always going to get to his head sooner or later, because as we've seen time and time again, Andrew Dobson was not someone who kept his opinions to himself, nor was he someone who handled criticism calmly. Instead of letting backlash roll off his shoulders, he tended to meet it with outrage, and that pattern was about to define his online legacy. And it wasn't just that he couldn't handle criticism, he often dished it out in ways that felt unnecessarily harsh. In other words, he was a bully. At one point, he mocked someone for misinterpreting an animation smear as an actual clue. Now, for those of you who don't know, animation smears are a pretty common technique, exaggerated in between frames and used to create the illusion of fast motion. But instead of simply correcting the misunderstanding and moving on, he took it to Twitter and even referenced it in his comic. We mean, look at this. Shows like Gravity Falls reward keen-eyed viewers with confirmations of their fan theories. However, I am starting to get worried that people are becoming a little too preoccupied with uncovering clues in their favorite shows, to the point that there are people out there legitimately scrutinizing motion effects as if it were some secret cryptic hidden message. He also wrote on Twitter, when you're so deep into looking for lore and clues, you think motion effects mean something. Psst, don't tell this person about animatoon smears. We mean, this was just unnecessary. And it showed the kind of person Dobson was online. That kind of behavior is what really started raising eyebrows, because turning a minor mistake into public ridicule and then immortalizing it in comic form doesn't exactly scream thick skin. If anything, it reinforced the growing perception that Andrew wasn't just reactive to comments about, well, anything, he could be a bully about it too. Criticism he received, he felt the need to reference in his comics. And for instance, this one where he said that he does not care that people don't like his trashy jokes. And let's be honest, his art wasn't anything groundbreaking either. It wasn't terrible, and it certainly wasn't the worst the internet had ever seen. But the real issue people pointed out was stagnation. His art style barely evolved over the years. The proportions, the line work, and the expressions remained largely the same. And the main reason for that? He did not take kindly to suggestions or constructive criticism. Overall, if we try to list down the major complaints people had about his art, the most consistent one was inconsistent facial features. Characters' eyes, proportions, and expressions would often shift from panel to panel in ways that didn't feel intentional, something many artists flagged as a basic area that needed refinement. Besides this, he also had a very dry sense of humor, like extremely dry. On Twitter and Tumblr, he would often go on lengthy rants defending his style and justifying every single creative choice he made. He genuinely believed he was one of the best in the scene, and he acted like it. I mean, just look at this tweet. I've been an artist long enough to know that artistic growth happens whether you like it or not, so it's not a priority for me. But if we start diving into his Twitter history, which, don't worry, we will in a bit, we'll fall straight into another rabbit hole. So for now, let's stick to the things that initially landed him in hot water. His lack of humility and the entitlement that often came with it. For example, take his artwork of Steven Universe characters drawn in the style of late manga artist Leiji Matsumoto. For those of you who don't know, Leiji Matsumoto is the creator and artist of classic anime like Captain Harlock, Galaxy Express 999, and Interstellar 5555. And if you actually compare Matsumoto's style to Dobson's, you can see they're not really the same. The line work, the composition, the atmosphere, it's a completely different league. But hey, at least he tried. However, the funniest part about this whole situation was that he mistook Leiji Matsumoto for a woman, which is ironic, especially considering Dobson often positioned himself as a die-hard classic anime fan. You'd think someone that passionate about the medium would know that Matsumoto, the legendary creator behind iconic manga works, is in fact a man. He even said in his post about the Steven Universe characters, Leiji Matsumoto is the writer and illustrator of the famed manga Galaxy Express 999. I thought it would be fun to see what Steven Universe would look like if it were drawn in her style. And that little slip-up led to widespread ridicule. Memes popped up almost immediately. And honestly, memes were another thing the internet did exceptionally well when it came to Dobson. There were so many fan edits and jokes made about him that they practically became a genre of their own. And the reason they stuck? Because they managed to summarize, sometimes brutally, sometimes hilariously, everything people felt was off about his online persona. And one interesting thing we need to talk about is his stance on modern anime. Dobson openly claimed he hated almost all anime made after the 90s. Anything post-1999, in his eyes, downhill. And the reason he gave for this is where it gets strange. For a little context, the Disney film Treasure Planet was released in 2002, and it famously underperformed at the box office. After that, Walt Disney Animation Studios began shifting more aggressively towards CGI projects, and there were layoffs as the studio restructured. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with Dobson hating anime? According to Dobson's own reasoning, Treasure Planet was influenced by anime aesthetic. The film bombed. Disney pivoted. Animators were let go. And somehow in his mind, that chain of events contributed to derailing his lifelong dream of becoming a Disney animator. Yes, that was the logic. In his words, the only reason I don't have an animation job right now is because Disney fired their animators after their anime-influenced movie Treasure Planet tanked at the box office. If they weren't trying to do more adult cartoons, maybe they might still have some respect in the industry. But now, thanks to anime, I lost my job, and Disney has become a sequel factory that mass produces for money. So yeah, instead of just acknowledging the industry shift towards CGI as a broader business decision, he placed part of the blame on anime's influence. From there, his resentment toward anything modern anime just intensified. He would bring up reasons, stylistic, cultural, industry-based, to argue that anime had ruined things. However, However, we think his biggest controversy to date came in 2012, the whole Big Ben poster fiasco. Anyone who knows Dobson knows that he was very protective of his work and defended it vigorously. A good example of this was a poster he created celebrating British pop culture. So Dobson was invited to attend MCM, a convention in London, as part of DeviantArt's Fresh Epics. To show his excitement, he designed and drew a special poster that he planned to sell at the convention. He even posted both the initial sketch and the final finished version online. Now you can see that in the final poster there is an image of Big Ben in the background, which looks nothing like the one in the initial sketch. Now this was actually traced directly from a photograph without crediting the original photographer, and it wasn't just a subtle reference or loose inspiration. The tracing was obvious. What made it worse was that he then put the artwork up for sale. When people called him out, his argument was that he traced the building because most images of Big Ben are public domain, so he didn't need to credit anyone. According to him, that made it acceptable, but that defense didn't sit well with a lot of people. This whole fiasco actually led to a YouTuber by the name of Forever Pandering, also known as Ken Ashcorp, making a rather catchy song about Dobson's tracing controversy. And you can probably guess how that went. Dobson did not respond well to it at all. Instead of brushing it off, he went into full defensive mode, writing long posts filled with big legal-sounding terms like copyright infringement, and making statements that only escalated the situation further. He even asked people whether if he redrew it on paper from scratch, they would finally believe that he hadn't traced it. That was part of his defense, as if recreating the same image again would somehow undo the original accusation. He also argued that people were accusing him of copyright infringement while simultaneously using his own comics to make parodies. In his view, that was hypocritical, but critics pointed out that parody and tracing without credit aren't exactly the same thing, especially when money is involved. And in the end, he claimed he was washing his hands of the entire situation by finally crediting the photographer. And guess what? He actually went ahead and drew the building on paper to prove his point. He even uploaded a video on his YouTube channel showing himself drawing Big Ben completely from scratch, just to demonstrate that he could do it without tracing. But the more he talked, the deeper he dug himself in. All of those responses eventually led to another video from Forever Pandering, Sins of a Complacent Artist, which did a pretty thorough job of breaking down Dobson's arguments and pointing out what many viewers saw as glaring hypocrisy.
I'm gonna spell this out really slow so that you can understand. You listening? You are taking a Creative Commons licensed picture, referencing or tracing it, and then putting it in a picture to then sell for money, despite giving no credit to the original photographer. No, I don't care that you've done it now. Just like referencing Big Ben on paper, you didn't do it until prompted. The emphasis here is selling for money. Under the Creative Commons license on the picture of Big Ben, you also have to distribute your picture under the same attribution share-alike license, which means, if I'm correct, that the high-resolution image must be public domain, which makes seeing how much Big Ben is alike to the original pretty easy. But I mean, you could have just been not lazy and saved yourself a whole lot of trouble. The point is that you didn't. You didn't reference a picture on paper, put it into your artwork, and then correctly attribute the photographer upon release. You didn't stick with your original drawing of Big Ben, which is absolutely fine and was stylized to the rest of the picture. You didn't also do this for the TARDIS, which I could probably bring up, but the point is that it's pretty easy to focus on Big Ben because it sticks out like a sore thumb.
And by that point, the narrative around Andrew wasn't just about tracing anymore, it was about how he handled being called out. However, despite everything, you might be thinking, well, at least he can draw, at least he's talented. Well, not really. Dobson's talent was questionable at best. He constantly took heavy inspiration from other artists and rarely, if ever, credited them. On top of that, he sold a lot of art that included unlicensed characters. And of course, he referenced it in his comic. However, the biggest and most telling example of Dobson's skills, or lack thereof, came from a commission piece. He was asked to draw a picture of Samus breaking out of her power suit. On paper, it was a fairly simple commission, nothing too complicated or difficult. He charged $45 for it, promising to send updates to the person who commissioned it. And guess what? Despite being an experienced artist who dabbled in webcomics, he took 4 whole months to complete the project. And honestly, the quality didn't even justify the wait. But the funniest part? The commission wasn't from a normal fan. No, it was actually commissioned by none other than 4chan, a website notorious for trolling and chaotic antics. So not only was the turnaround painfully slow, blow, but the whole thing was also set up to be a bit of a prank. So yeah, 4chan basically wanted to see what would happen if they commissioned Dobson to create a piece, and well, that's exactly what happened. But even after all that, Dobson didn't stay quiet. Anytime someone said anything critical about his art, or really anything about him in general, he would blow up like a balloon. He was so into. He ranted endlessly about the incident, claiming he was so traumatized that he wouldn't take any commission work again. In his own words, Dobson wrote, "That's my horror story of how abusive trolls manipulated me during my time of need, and used me to further their cognitive bias smear campaign against me. Fuck them, and fuck everyone who supported them." But here's the thing. He wasn't the only one telling the story. The people who commissioned the artwork also shared their side, and according to them, Dobson was far more invested in replying to comments on Twitter and giving unsolicited teenage advice on DeviantArt than actually completing the commission. So while he painted himself as a victim of online abuse, the reality, at least from the commissioner's perspective, was a bit different. His focus on drama and defending himself often came at the expense of actually doing the work he was being paid for. By 2010, Dobson had become so infamous online that the entire internet knew exactly how easy it was to get a rise out of him. Seriously, everyone knew he would explode at the slightest provocation. Case in point, at one convention in 2010, someone walked up to his booth and sprayed him in the face. The moment would go down in history as one of the most epic Dobson moments. No exaggeration. But if his comics were chaotic, his Twitter was pure madness. His feed became a non-stop stream of rants, defenses, and opinions on literally everything. And just to give you guys a little context, let's take a look at some of the actual tweets that Dobson posted. These give a clear window into his personality and how he presented himself online. Take this one, for instance. "I can trace my dislike for my own gender back to first grade when I realized I wasn't as violent or angry as so many of my peers." What he's basically doing here is setting himself up as better than everyone else, a recurring theme throughout his online persona, and it doesn't stop there. In another instance, he lashed out at Burger Inc., apparently for perpetuating what he's considered a toxic masculinity joke. He couldn't tolerate even lighthearted humor that didn't align with his personal world. Time and again, these posts show a man obsessed with positioning himself as above the crowd, morally, intellectually, and artistically. Every little criticism or joke became an opportunity for Dobson to assert how much better he was than the rest of us mere mortals. And the funniest part? He carried this holier-than-thou attitude throughout it all, insisting that the stress and pain of dealing with critics was somehow noble. Everybody energy was so deeply ingrained in his personality that he carried it straight into his comics, and to put it lightly, people did not like it. He quickly found himself in hot water over one particular incident, the infamous Power Girl incident. For those of you hearing about Dobson for the first time, brace yourselves for what he considered an amazing heroic act on his part. This panel comes from his "So, You're a Cartoonist?" webcomic. In it, he depicted a girl dressed as DC's Power Girl being harassed by someone at an event. According to Dobson's version of the story, he noticed this girl being harassed, grabbed a bat, and allegedly beat the shit out of the guy, because in his telling, that's just the kind of hero he was. But here's where it gets interesting, and far less heroic than he claimed. The reality was very different. In 2019, someone actually tracked down a picture of the girl Dobson was referring to, and it became clear that his entire comic version of the event was completely fabricated. The harassment, the bat-wielding heroics, all exaggerated, if not outright invented. And here's the girl in question. As you can see, she's willingly and consensually posing for the camera. There's no harassment happening at all. But according to Dobson, he was the hero who saved her. If you look closely in the background of the photo, Dobson's actually sitting there, probably just witnessing the scene. But it definitely wasn't anything like how he represented it in his comic. A lot of people online also pointed out that the person taking the photo and the girl in the Power Girl costume were actually in a relationship at the time. So it makes absolutely no sense why Dobson would think she was being harassed, unless, of course, he just needed a narrative to fit his hero complex. His comic about this incident has been lampooned by so many people online that it's honestly impossible to show all of them here, but we'll share a few. And in most cases, the story ends with Dobson himself getting the beating, which we have to admit is kind of satisfying. And even after all this, Dobson would not shut up about anything. As we said, he felt the need to respond to everything and anything, and this was no exception. He wrote, "Not only is that not a convention I've ever attended, but they can't even agree on which person in the background is supposedly me. But that's not the point. The point is that the cosplayer in this photo clearly isn't being harassed for having a sexy picture taken. Therefore, I must have made up the event. And this is photographic proof. The mental gymnastics these people go through to maintain their hatred of me is truly amazing. This would be hilarious if it weren't treated as an abject fact by these people. Welcome to my life, y'all. Here's a pro tip for anyone else out there who may not like me or my work. Just fucking block me, alright? It's the easiest solution. Just block and ignore me. I'll go about my life, you go about yours, and we never have to cross paths. Go waste your pretzel logic on a more worthwhile cause, like Pizzagate. And what can we say? This post is basically Andrew Dobson in a nutshell. He refuses to let reality get in the way of his ego. He frames himself as the perpetual victim, and he turns minor critiques into grandiose spectacles where he is the star. Even when photographic evidence clearly disproves his heroic narrative, he doubles down, performing outrage for anyone who dares disagree, and somehow manages to sprinkle in a weirdly self-important life lesson about blocking him while dragging absurd conspiracies like Pizzagate into it, because naturally, everything is either about him or something that proves how clever and persecuted he is. Now by this point, you might be thinking, okay, what else is there to know about this guy? He's already completely deranged, makes things up constantly, argues relentlessly, and never admits when he's wrong. But believe it or not, that's only scratching the surface. There's still so much more you need to know about Andrew Dobson to truly understand the full extent of, well, him. And yes, of course, we are going to dive into his utterly bizarre fetishes soon. For those of you who have known him or followed him online before, you might already know that Andrew Dobson presents himself as a feminist, at least as a self-proclaimed big feminist. From the tweets we showed you earlier, it's clear he has a zero-tolerance policy for toxic masculinity, sexist jokes, and general bad behavior. He simply cannot handle or stand by any form of discrimination. Because of course Dobson sees himself as a hero of all things righteous. Someone has to stand up for women's rights, right? And while he certainly does speak up on important issues, there's a very interesting side to him that complicates this heroic feminist image. You see, despite his moral crusades, he seemingly has no problem whatsoever indulging in a bit of objectification here and there, sometimes in ways that make you question just how serious his feminism really is. So yes, he'll call out the worst of toxic masculinity online, but somewhere between the tweets about social justice and the lectures on gender equality, Dobson's personal quirks and contradictions sneak in. And trust me, understanding those quirks is essential if you want to get the full chaotic picture of Andrew Dobson. For instance, he presented himself as pro-LGBTQ, but had no problem being a little homophobic himself. So yeah, the point is, Dobson thought of himself as this ultra-woke, left-leaning, socially aware guy, but in reality he was full of contradictions. And we haven't even touched on his obsession with the L part of LGBTQ. Dobson wholeheartedly supported the lesbian community. Well, kind of. But his support came with a very personal twist. He didn't just like lesbians, he fetishized them. He openly drew and sexualized lesbian couples, and if that wasn't enough, he even went as far as creating an entire comic centered around this kink. Yep, you heard that right. Now, the real controversy around Dobson and lesbian representation started with his infamous comic, The Adventure of Alex Z. Pirate. On the surface, it might seem like just another story with some drama, but it's filled with way too much lesbian tension, and not in a healthy or respectful way. And just to be clear, we're not saying the relationships in this comic were the problem. The issue is how Dobson wrote them, creepy, fetishized, and obviously tailored to his own gratification. You might think, okay, maybe he just wanted representation, but a single look at the scenes makes it painfully clear. This comic wasn't about giving lesbians proper representation. It was about feeding his own fantasies. The story revolves around three main characters, Sam, Alex, and Atea. Alex has the hots for the boy pirate Sam, Atea has all the hots for Alex, and Sam only cares about the treasure. And while the plot could have been fun or adventurous, the comic instead becomes a mess of weird objectification and incredibly poor representation of lesbian relationships. We mean, just look at it. Every interaction is framed in a way that sexualizes the characters rather than exploring any meaningful relationship or dynamic. It's clear that Dobson's so-called support for lesbians was heavily laced with his own personal kinks, making the comic more about his desires than the characters themselves. And if you want just a little sneak peek of what this comic actually looked like, the story constantly revolved around Atea wanting Alex, making wishes for her clothes to magically disappear. And of course, bam, and Dobson always found a way to make it happen. It's painfully obvious he was obsessed with sexualizing these characters. On top of that, the comic is filled with groping, explicit scenes, and other non-consensual content that crosses serious boundaries, stuff that we honestly don't even want to go into in detail. Another very famous lesbian couple Dobson created was Korra and Asami from the Legend of Korra universe. This couple became somewhat popular, but even then many people criticized Dobson's portrayal. Dobson even had this term called lesbian kick. One of the most infamous examples of this was in a comic where Atea kicks a blonde woman during a beauty contest while shouting, "lesbian kick." Dobson even tried to monetize this moment, attempting to sell posters and shirts featuring the quote because he thought it could become an internet meme. And here's the funniest and most telling part. Most of these t-shirts were made for men, at least the majority of them. If Dobson had actually designed them to empower lesbian couples or women, maybe it could have come across as somewhat supportive. But instead, they heavily leaned toward fetishized content, turning women's relationships into a joke. It's not empowerment, it's objectification packaged as representation. Another example of his pure weirdness from The Adventure Alex Z. Pirate is this one. In this picture, Sam asks why there are so many women on the ship, and the other characters respond by listing a variety of qualities women supposedly have. Sure, some of those qualities might exist in reality, but the way Dobson frames it is performative, over the top, and frankly hilarious in a disturbing way. He constantly defends women like a stage actor performing feminism rather than someone genuinely respecting them. A lot of people think that Dobson hates men, and he has even said that he hates his own gender. On the surface, that might make sense, but this hatred isn't a pure disdain for masculinity. It's deeply tied to his obsession with women. Dobson seems to see women as weak, vulnerable creatures who can't stand up for themselves. In his mind, they're naive and easily manipulated, perfect subjects for sexualization and objectification disguised as empowerment. For example, in the comment sections of his page, people frequently called out the creepiness of his content. Someone commented on his post saying, "Actually, women are a lot harsher to each other than men are. When catfights or cold wars, you know we no longer like each other. Honestly, be fair, women aren't special at all." He replied to this with, "Nah, women are very special. They are genetically speaking the dominant species. The men are mutations." While another comment read, "Men who exhibit a fragile sense of masculinity are the reasons we shouldn't be picking on fragile masculinity. That's just acknowledging a weak spot and then hitting it." Dobson also responded to this one, of course, saying, "No, that's called trying to fix a broken system." Honestly, this guy was just too much. Someone from the lesbian community once messaged him directly, expressing just how uncomfortable and weird his comics were, and Dobson's response? Defensive, dismissive, and tone-deaf. He often replied as if the criticism itself was an attack on him, not on the content. The message read, "As a lesbian teenager, your lesbian teenager obsession actually scares me. Please don't be a dick to the many LGBTA fans for whom this is a deal. Also, as far as I know, you're straight. I personally don't think the ending was any big deal anyway. There are canon and openly gay couples in cartoons. This was not an example of any such thing." And guess what? He responded to this message the exact way you would expect Dobson to respond. He wrote, 1. Duly noted. Don't care. 2. So because I'm straight, I'm not allowed to want LGBTA people to enjoy their moment and to shut up people trying to tell them it's no big deal. 3. The fact that Korra, and specifically the hashtag Korrasami, was trending shortly after it happened. I'm going to have to disagree with you on the idea that it's not a big deal. Clearly a lot of people do think it is a big deal, and if that wasn't enough, another major red flag is that many of the female characters in Alex Z Pirate were reportedly inspired by real-life women Dobson had crushes on. Yes, you read that right. Most of the women he drew were actual girls he had a thing for, and he openly admitted it on his DeviantArt account. He wrote, "It seems like whenever I add another character to the pirate universe, it's always a woman for some reason. Part of this comes from the fact that all of the original pirate characters are based on real people, and that hasn't stopped yet, with the inclusion of the ninja. Alex and Atea are both based on people I met at the pre-college program in 1998, and Aliunde is based on Alex's real-life friend. In reality, it makes a perfect sense, but in the comic world, it's a little odd." So yeah, Dobson basically specialized on all women he had a thing for, and he could not get them. This, according to us, is a classic case of sexual frustration, but this is still not over, and nothing better illustrates this lack of genuine respect and general frustration than the infamous Zelda Williams tweet incident. So around the 1-year anniversary of her father Robin Williams' suicide, Zelda Williams tweeted about how rough that week was for her. Totally understandable, right? Anyone would be upset in that situation. She wrote, "This week has been a tough one, near and far. Sometimes I fight it with laughter, other times with information. Today, strangely, I am at a loss. Enter Andrew Dobson." And oh boy, he really outdid himself this time. Now let's give the guy the tiniest shred of credit. Maybe he thought he was being helpful, like, "Here, this'll make you laugh and cheer up." A sweet gesture. If you were a preteen sending memes, not a man in his late 30s. But let's roll with it. Here's the kicker though. Instead of a normal, "hope this helps" on type of message, Dobson essentially told a grieving woman mourning her father's death to calm thy tits. As you might imagine, backlash was swift, but then again, this is Dobson we are dealing with, so he tried his best to defend himself and then eventually deleted his comment. He also got super offended if people even brought this up. He insisted that since he deleted the tweet and apologized, everyone should just move on and never mention it again, except he never actually apologized. After deleting the tweet, he posted this gem. Instead of saying, "Hey Zelda, I was wrong, I'm sorry," he just went with some vague, humble brag style tweet about deleting a tweet that was offending people. Notice the brilliance. No context, no mention of Zelda Williams, and of course, no actual apology. Just a sly, never say I don't apologize, which apparently counts as an apology in Dobson's world. And when someone tried to get him to actually apologize to Zelda, he doubled down. He linked a tweet about deleting the original one, but still didn't explain that it was about her grieving her father, didn't say it could be offensive, and didn't acknowledge he was wrong. It was basically, "Some people didn't like that, sorry, they were overreacting." Classic Dobson. Always the victim, never the responsible adult. That being said, let's move on to something even more disgusting about Dobson. Something that absolutely shattered the image he tried so hard to project as a feminist, a champion of women's rights, and someone who supposedly does not tolerate objectification. Because guess what? Dobson had a whole other persona called Catty N, under which he posted what many call inflation art. For those unfamiliar, inflation art is, well, a kink. And not just any kink. This one involves imagery and illustrations of women being filled with air or other substances, sometimes just certain parts of their bodies, sometimes their entire bodies floating around like balloons. And yes, it's as weird and unsettling as it sounds. Here's the kicker. A lot of people didn't even know Dobson was behind this. He used an alias, get ready for this, a lesbian teenage girl persona, to promote his art. During the early 2000s, many of Dobson's old inflation artworks began resurfacing under the Catty N name on DeviantArt, and apparently, his fetish supposedly started from a love of blowing up balloons, which somehow escalated into this after he discovered other fetish artists like Inflate123 and Luther5 Kane. There's also a Catty N website, which is mostly gone now, but don't worry, plenty of the work has been archived, and it's every bit as disgusting as you'd expect. Most of it features women being massively inflated, often completely nude, and treated like literal balloons. In a DeviantArt post, Dobson did admit that he created this fetish artwork, but true to form, he also blamed internet trolls and haters for digging up information, never once fully owning how disturbing it actually was. And as if that wasn't enough, he apparently also ran games on the Catty N site, where women were being inflated and punctured like balloons. So let's recap. This is Dobson, the man who, in public, rails against objectification and claims to champion women's rights. And in private, he's drawing women as literal human balloons, inflating them and posting them online. A grown man in his 30s living out some deranged balloon fantasy in the most disturbing way possible. And let us just remind, in Dobson's own words, the objectification of women involves the act disregarding the personal and intellectual abilities and capabilities of a female and reducing a woman's worth or role to that of an instrument for the sexual pleasure that she can produce in the mind of another. So yeah, this is definitely not objectification. You see, what Dobson thought he was doing was praising women. In his mind, he wasn't objectifying them, he was elevating them, putting them on a pedestal, talking about them like they were this dominant, superior species that men could never measure up to. And on the surface, that might sound flattering. But here's the thing, putting women on a pedestal isn't the same as respecting them. Turning them into some mythical, dominant life form isn't empowerment, it's just a different flavor of weird. It's still reducing real people into a concept, just with sparkles on top. And if that wasn't enough, Tumblr had more to say, because at some point, users began accusing Dobson of drawing tentacle porn. Now, are we shocked? Not exactly. Considering the inflation persona already floating around, the idea that he might have dipped his toes into tentacle territory doesn't exactly feel like a plot twist, it feels on brand. Yeah, at that point, it's not about kink shaming at all, it's about the hypocrisy. If someone privately likes weird stuff, cool, adults can have their niches. But when you build your entire public identity around being morally superior, anti-objectification, pro-women, and then secretly run an account posting fetish content while judging everyone else, that's where it stops being he has a kink and starts being you're performing a persona, and that pattern shows up again with the Hanukkah incident. Back in the 2000s, Andrew Dobson claimed on his DeviantArt account that he had a Jewish girlfriend. When he was introduced to Hanukkah, instead of just learning about it respectfully, he compared it negatively to Christmas and called it boring because he couldn't go home, and that alone's immature. But then he doubled down by making a Danny and Spot comic about it. In it, a lady comes up to Danny and Spot shouting "Merry Christmas!" and Danny replies with "Happy Hanukkah." The lady is then scared, and when Spot mentions that Danny is neither Jewish nor religious, Danny says, "I know! I just like reminding people that not everybody celebrates the same things." Now this is where Dobson really starts feeding into the exact beliefs that keep popping up every year, especially the whole "you can't say Merry Christmas, it's bad" narrative. He leaned into that culture war talking point hard. Dobson himself had a long list of things he openly disliked or mocked. He hated Christmas. He hated FPS games. He complained about anime. He criticized pretty much everything. Then there's the carnival mask situation. He didn't just dislike carnival masks, he was genuinely terrified of them. So much so that people would deliberately spam images of carnival masks in comment sections just to scare him or get a reaction. And that right there says a lot about how the internet viewed him. Once people realized something got under his skin, they weaponized it. That's how online culture works. If you react strongly, they'll keep pressing that button. But over time, people started realizing something bigger. Dobson wasn't just controversial because of heated arguments or strong opinions. He wasn't just someone who debated too much. There was something off, something strange. His behavior patterns, his constant defensiveness, and his need to respond to everything, it made him stand out in a way that wasn't flattering. And then the inflation persona was discovered. After that, it was basically over. Once people found out about his inflation fetish account, the internet latched onto it immediately. Not just because it was a niche or unusual, but because it clashed so heavily with the moral image he tried to project. The hypocrisy angle made it meme material, and once you become meme material, there's no going back. From that point on, it was nearly impossible for him to exist online without someone bringing it up. Any platform he moved to, DeviantArt, forums, comment sections, or even Minecraft, he was followed by trolls, relentlessly. The humiliation train had officially left the station, and because Dobson was such an emotionally charged, reactive person, he couldn't ignore it. He responded, he argued, he fought back, but here's the thing, you cannot fight the entire internet, and the more he tried, the worse it got. On top of that, his political opinions didn't help his case either. Dobson has always been very vocal about his liberal views. If you scrolled through his Twitter, you'd see plenty of posts about sexism, social justice, and cultural issues. He positioned himself firmly on the progressive side of the internet. But here's where it gets complicated. While he frequently called out sexism, some critics started accusing him of swinging too far in the opposite direction, claiming that his tone sometimes came off less like equality and more like outright hostility toward men. The word misandrist began floating around in discussions about him. And then came the Vivian James situation. For context, Vivian James was a character created during the whole Gamergate era, the messy, chaotic online movement that involved harassment campaigns against women in gaming, including figures like Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian. It was tied heavily to internet culture wars and factions of the alt-right. Dobson, being Dobson, jumped into the discourse. He created comics mocking Vivian James, portraying the character as inherently sexist and misogynistic because of her association with 4chan. In his view, the character symbolized something toxic. Vivian James wasn't quite what he framed her as. The character was actually developed in collaboration with the Fine Young Capitalists, a group that raised money to support female game developers. So when Dobson went in swinging, some of his own audience pushed back. They argued that he had misinterpreted the character's purpose entirely. Instead of delivering a sharp critique of internet misogyny, he ended up attacking something that had more nuance than he acknowledged. Eventually, he apologized. But of course, it was done in a comedic comic format, because why issue a straightforward statement when you can make it content? And then 2016 happened. The US presidential election cycle was already a digital dumpster fire, and Dobson decided to participate in the most Dobson way possible, loudly. Around that time, he posted multiple tweets expressing extreme hostility toward then-candidate Donald Trump. We're not talking mild criticism, we're talking tweets that included death threats and statements implying that Trump's death would benefit humanity. He also publicly praised comedian Kathy Griffin during her own highly controversial Trump stunt. And as you can imagine, that did not go over smoothly. He received heavy backlash, not just from conservatives, but from people who felt he had crossed a line. Eventually, Twitter suspended him for over a month due to reports about those tweets. When he returned, did he apologize? Not exactly. He stated that he wouldn't apologize for his views on Trump, but he would be more careful with his language going forward. In fact, he also told Kathy Griffin that she also shouldn't apologize. He said, and quote, "You shouldn't have to apologize, that was badass and awesome." At this point, the pattern was undeniable. Dobson didn't just have opinions. He had reactions. Big ones, loud ones, the kind that turn into screenshots, suspensions, and long-term reputational baggage. In the end, Andrew Dobson's online legacy is defined less by his art and more by the contradictions that surrounded him. For years, he presented himself as a progressive feminist ally, someone who stood firmly against toxic masculinity and claimed to advocate for representation. Yet time and time again, his work told a different story. From fetishizing lesbian relationships and objectifying women under the banner of empowerment, to inserting his own personal obsessions into his comics, Dobson's behavior consistently blurred the line between advocacy and self-indulgence. What he framed as support often came across as performative, self-serving, and deeply hypocritical. And then, almost as suddenly as he rose to internet notoriety, he vanished. Beginning around 2020, Dobson wiped nearly all of his presence from the internet, removing his art and comics from YouTube, ex-Tumblr, and his personal website without any explanation. No farewell post, no clarification, just silence. Theories quickly began circulating. One of the most common speculations was that family interference played a role, particularly after rumors spread that his brother had lost a government job opportunity due to Dobson's controversial online reputation. However, no concrete confirmation has ever surfaced. The true reason for his disappearance remains unknown. But even though Dobson left without warning, the internet didn't forget. In late 2023, discussions about him and his past antics resurfaced and went viral after he became the subject of a YouTube video by Magic Mush and many others. Suddenly, a new wave of viewers revisited the controversies, comics, the contradictions, and the long-standing criticism surrounding his work. His attempt at a quiet exit ultimately didn't erase the digital footprint he left behind. And maybe that's the most fitting conclusion to the Andrew Dobson saga. You can delete posts, wipe accounts, and disappear from timelines, but the conversations, the screenshots, and the impact you leave on communities don't vanish that easily. In Dobson's case, what remains isn't the image of a principled feminist hero, but a complicated internet figure remembered more for hypocrisy and controversy than for the art he once tried to promote.